Good morning and welcome to the 18th meeting of the Social Justice and Social Security Committee for 2025. We have apologies from Paul O'Kane. Before we begin, I would like to place on record the committee's thanks to the women from Scottish Women's Aid Survivor Reference Group for taking the time to meet with us yesterday to discuss the evidence heard during our inquiry into financial considerations when leaving an abusive relationship. So it is very much appreciated, and it was really helpful as well to chat with them last night. So thank you for that. Our first item of business is a decision on whether to take items 5 and 6 in private. Are we all agreed? Yes. Thank you. Our next item of business today is an oral evidence session on legislative consent memorandum LCM S655. This LCM has been lodged by the Scottish Government in relation to the Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill. Members will wish to note that the Scottish Government is recommending consent to the provisions in the memorandum, with the exception at this time of the provisions in relation to overpayment recovery, debt recovery and enforcement. The Scottish Government has yet to set out its views on these provisions and has indicated that they are subject to ongoing discussion and will be the subject of a supplementary legislative consent motion. So I welcome the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, Shirley-Anne Somerville, to the meeting. I also welcome her officials from the Scottish Government, Gemma McAllister, Lawyer, Legal Directorate, and Simon Coote, Head of the Cross-Cutting Policy Unit. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make some brief opening remarks on the LCM. Thank you.
Thank you very much and good morning, Convener. As Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, I must ensure that UK social security legislation which impacts in Scotland is compatible with the principles embedded within the devolved social security system. I must also be mindful of anything that might disrupt the safe and secure transfer of benefits. I have considered this bill carefully, and it is clear that in practice it only has implications for Scotland insofar as DWP still administrates devolved assistance under agency agreement on behalf of Scottish ministers. I am therefore content that any impacts on devolved assistance from the provisions under consideration today will be negligible, and can confirm that I intend to recommend consent to the provision in the following areas. Entry, search and seizure. These provisions will allow the DWP to apply to a sheriff for a warrant to enter premises, search for and seize items when investigating the most serious cases of fraud. Currently, the DWP require the police to undertake this action on their behalf. I am content that nothing within these provisions runs contrary to the ethos and principles underpinning the devolved social security system. On data gathering with regard to these provisions, the UK Government have broadly mirrored the approach pioneered in the devolved social security system. Because of this, and because of the provisions containing similar safeguards and exemptions around third sector organisations, I am content to recommend legislative consent. On eligibility verification measures, these provisions allow the DWP to require banks and financial institutions to provide large data sets to help verify a claimant's entitlement to benefits and identify incorrect payments. Similar provisions were included within the UK Data Protection and Digital Information Bill of last year, for which legislative consent was agreed in the Scottish Parliament, but which fell away due to the UK general election. On changes to administrative penalties, there is no equivalent to administrative penalties within the devolved system, and I am therefore content to recommend consent for the provisions in this area. Convener, although not included in this memorandum, the Scottish Government did not previously take a position on consent in relation to the overpayment recovery provisions, which you mentioned in your opening remarks. This was to allow time for due consideration to be given to the impact of these provisions on Scottish clients and for ongoing discussions with the UK Government. I can, however, now confirm to the committee that I have concluded that it would not be appropriate to recommend consent for the overpayment recovery provisions. No such provisions exist within the devolved system, and I do not consider them compatible with the ethos of fairness, dignity and respect. I have set out this position in writing to UK ministers, who in response have confirmed that they will seek to amend the bill such that devolved benefits are removed from the scope of these provisions. Convener, the Scottish Government did not see the full provisions of this bill until it was laid on the 22nd of January 2025. This meant that the normal timeframes for lodging this legislative consent motion could not be met. Due to the ongoing engagement required to understand where the bill and its numerous amendments will impact in Scotland, I expect there will be a requirement to lodge a supplementary LCM for the bill in due course, and will provide an update on the debt recovery provisions as part of the supplementary LCM. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We will now move to questions, and our questions will be directed to you, but you are, of course, welcome to invite any officials to respond should you wish to do so. So I'm going to hand over to Bob Doris first of all. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Can I just maybe start with a general question? Because I suppose what this LCM does, it shines light on the continued use of agency agreements, in this case severe disablement allowance and industrial injuries disablement benefit. I suppose it would be reasonable to ask whether or not, because the provision has been sought within the LCM, whether or not this puts more urgency on plans the Scottish Government's got for developing employment injury assistance, or does it change the balance between sticking with agency agreements and rolling out our own devolved benefits standalone and our own rights? Any information you can give us about that continued use of agency agreements and how long that's likely to last for, I think would be very helpful. It kind of gives a context to what we're looking at here this morning.
Certainly. Well, Mr Doris will be aware from his long involvement in these issues that the decision was taken right at the very start not to devolve STA due to the fact it was a closed benefit with an exceptionally small caseload even at that time, and becoming smaller year on year. And at that point there was seen to be no benefit to the devolution of that benefit. In terms of either to the clients or indeed to the costs it would take to actually develop a devolved alternative up here. When we've looked at employment injury assistance, clearly we've recently undertaken a consultation on that, and I do appreciate people wish to see changes on this, but because the changes that people wish to see are really quite significant, we did consult on whether it would be better to extend that agency agreement and allow those more extensive consultations to happen. Given that was the outcome of the consultation, I'm still very much minded to move forward on that basis, and indeed the work has now begun on the employment injury assistance and looking at that in detail. So hopefully that will demonstrate that the work is ongoing on this, but I think it's important to carry on with those timescales given the detailed consideration that's required, particularly around employment injury assistance.
In terms of the agency agreement, do you anticipate that it will be completed before the actual bill actually comes into force?
So we do expect the case transfer, which therefore relates to the major agency agreements that we have on benefits. We expect that case transfer to complete on timetable. The agency agreements relating to benefits will end in March 2026, and we have a timetable of ending the case transfers by the end of this calendar year. I would say, Convener, I think the case transfer process is one of the great successes of the devolution of social security, given it has gone exceptionally smoothly when we look at what can perhaps go wrong when we're undertaking such large changes to benefits. So we do anticipate that to continue, and then that would bring to an end clearly the agency agreements around carers, for example, that we have in place currently.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to pass over to Liz Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Can I just ask about something you said in your opening remark in relation to Westminster deciding to amend the bill? Just looking at some of the House of Commons and House of Lords comments upon this bill, it's obviously a bit of a tortuous passage in certain areas, and I can understand why there has to be an amendment. Do you have an agreement from the Westminster Government as to exactly when that amendment process will take place and when it will be concluded?
Well, I think the challenge that we have as we attempt to move at pace with the amendments that are coming in is around, obviously other MPs will put in amendments as they see fit, but what we've certainly had in the past is a better ability to be able to adapt to UK government amendments before they're tabled, to be able to have those discussions. We're not in that space in this bill, unfortunately, and I think there is some lessons we can learn, I hope, in terms of both, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, when the bill was introduced and the fact that we didn't see it before that, particularly given it's such a complex piece, but also in the work of the UK government amendments. But if I can turn to my officials to know if we have a particular timetable that we've been estimated around the bill.
For additional amendments to be...
Well, it's just obviously there are significant issues, and the Cabinet Secretary has cited some of them, not least of which there are concerns about the sort of communication and when you saw the bill and various aspects about that. And if it does have to require another financial memorandum, then I'd be interested to know what timescale we're thinking about for that, because it obviously could be quite important.
I can't give you specifics on that. We can provide the committee with further information that we can glean from. Yeah,
I mean, I think the basic question is: do you see this being a protracted problem, or do you think it can be resolved?
So in the aspects of considering this bill, because of the exceptionally technical nature and complicated nature of this bill, it would be fair to say I remain concerned that we may have to come back on other issues. My officials are in really detailed discussions with UK Government on different amendments when they come up. So it is proving challenging in continuing to be able to do that. And I think, again, it's a further challenge to find a way where we have legislation which DWP UK Government may think is only to do with the reserve system, but actually has implications unintended in many instances, which we have been able to clear up in writing with the DWP. But this is perhaps one of those first significant bills where we're really having to tease out how we deal with the fact that when the DWP may think it's only to do with what happens in the rest of the UK, it actually does have implications for up here.
Okay, right, thank you.
Okay, yep, thanks very much. I'm now going to invite Jeremy Balfour in.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you for coming. Just following up on the previous question from my colleague Liz Smith. I mean, I appreciate you can't be exact, but when do you, I mean, are we talking the end of this year before we see a new... this being resolved? I mean, I'm just wondering a rough timescale would be helpful, if that is possible, or whether one of your officials can help out.
Certainly, yeah.
Yeah, so I can confirm that our understanding from DWP is that the Royal Assent will be towards the end of this year. So we are heading towards, you know, the culmination of the process. And the only other thing to add would be that I think DWP have been operating at pace in the development of this bill, which has had an effect on the way we've had to answer your question, the way we've also had to operate at pace, and that continues as we speak at the moment. But obviously, it's heading towards conclusion soon.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. I mean, I sit on the DPLR committee, and I have to say we were quite concerned when we first saw this, and I think your letter that came to the committee a couple of days ago was very helpful. So, can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that? But we did ask, the DPLR committee did ask about the involvement of the Scottish Government in decisions about the measures of this bill would be applied to devolved matters. Now, I know you picked this up a wee bit, but the relevant bodies are subject to agency agreement. To what extent is the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament decision being limited by the existence of these agency agreements, or can it be resolved through sensible negotiations between the both parties?
I think the agency agreements, as again you know, Mr Balfour, have been a very important part of the safe and secure transition of benefits. They've been absolutely integral to the way that the system has developed as we've gone through this. We are coming, as Convener has said, to the end of many of the agency agreements with the completion of case transfer. So that is an important milestone to allow us to therefore not have to have a system where we are obliged to do the same as the DWP because, and very understandably, the clear point from the DWP was if you have an agency agreement, you're doing it the same way as we are. And we've had those discussions in the past. The process of longer-term policy development beyond the lifespans of agency agreements are not hampered by them. Therefore, what they continue to face is the context, clearly, of policy decisions and therefore the financial implications of policy decisions by the DWP. So I think that's the next challenge on our horizon, if I can put it like that, rather than the agency agreements.
Since the Cabinet Secretary has opened a tin of worms there, perhaps I could without the Commissioner being too nasty to me, just push you on that very last point of, we've obviously seen quite a lot of changes suggested by the UK Government in regard to adult disability payment and other benefits. What negotiations are you having with the UK Government? And if you're able, do you have some kind of timescale of when this will have to come to a Scottish Parliament?
So on
before we go in, it's kind of you're veering towards something wider than what we're discussing in terms of the LCM.
I am.
So yeah, so I'm going to just stop you there, Jeremy. But thanks anyway.
I'll give you a challenge.
Okay, thank you. Okay, does anyone have any other questions? Okay, that's the case. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that, and I remind members that should any further LCMs be lodged in relation to the Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Bill, as it makes its way through the UK Parliament, the committee may need to make further consent decisions in relation to those later memorandums. Is the committee content to recommend to the Parliament that consent should be given for the relevant provisions covered by LCM S655?
Yes.
Thank you. Are members content to delegate responsibility to myself and the clerks to draft a report to the Parliament on the LCM? Okay. I thank the Cabinet Secretary and her officials as well for coming along. We'll have a short suspension to allow for a change of witnesses. Welcome back, and our next item of business is consideration of a Scottish statutory instrument. The Council Tax Reduction Miscellaneous Amendment Scotland No. 3 Regulations 2025. This instrument is subject to the negative procedure. Do members have any comments on the instrument? Okay, thank you. I invite the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any further recommendations in relation to this instrument. Are members content to note the instrument? Yes. Thank you. So our next item of business today is an evidence session on the housing emergency decisions made by some local authorities. And I very much welcome to the meeting Fiona Kell, Director of Policy, Homes for Scotland, John Blackwood, Chief Executive, Scottish Association of Landlords, Maeve McGoldrick, Head of Policy and Communications for Scotland Crisis. And they are all joining us in the room. And we also have Susie Fitton, Policy Manager, Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, and Mike Callaghan, Policy Manager, COSLA, and Tony Keane, Policy Manager, Association of Local Authority Chief Housing Officers, who are joining us online. So good morning to all of you. So I'm going to kick off with some questions, and I'm going to invite Jeremy in, first of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavina. I probably should say, if you don't want to answer a question, you don't have to. If someone said something that you agree with, you don't have to repeat it either, because obviously there's 6 of you here, so we want to get through as much evidence as we can. I suppose, can I start with a very basic question? And that is, does declaring a housing emergency have a real impact on how local authorities work? And can I maybe start with COSLA on that? Would that be okay?
Sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yep, can hear you fine.
Sorry, I had a problem with that on muting there. Yes, going to the question on housing emergencies, what prompted them, and it was a very good question. Essentially, it's been about the chronic lack of supply of housing, as you'll know very well, and unrelenting pressures of homelessness that have caused a systemic failure across services. But it's also at another level, it's about the local circumstances of local authorities across the country. It's been differences in different localities. Argyll and Bute as a local authority, Fife, Glasgow and Edinburgh. Aberdeen, for example, they've always had issues with RAC, which has caused around about 500,000 of their properties not be able to be in use for residents. In Glasgow, we've always got issues with migration into the city and trying to provide the provision of housing. So there have been a number of factors across the country that, in various local authorities that have been different, that contributed to them to declare housing emergencies. But that combination of factors is essentially driven by the increasing homelessness, lack of affordable housing. In some places like the city areas, rising rents, the social housing shortages, and the need to take, and local authorities to take immediate action through declaring these housing emergencies, to have a focus on mobilising resources and seeking solutions to what is an ongoing crisis. I mean, what we've seen around the country is some good examples of work from the likes of Glasgow, Edinburgh, South Lanarkshire, West Lothian, where they've been reducing void numbers, and rising to some of the challenges of these pressures from homelessness prevention work, proactive and joined up intervention by empty homes teams and target acquisitions to buy back family homes, particularly in these pressurised areas, to reduce the number of children in temporary accommodation and activities like that. But those local authorities still are facing some quite, as I mentioned, unrelenting pressures, and it still remains the case. There's still a pattern of severe pressures across the country. Thank you.
I don't know, does anyone else want to come in on this question?
Yes, please. I think it's a really interesting philosophical question in some ways. And I say philosophical because the concept of a housing emergency means something to everyone, you know, in a different shape or form. So I think the point of saying that we need help, things are out of control, have been beneficial. In particular, we've seen the reinvestment in the housing budget as a response probably directly to the declaration of housing emergencies, both at a local and national level. And equally, we've seen a much more concerted effort to try and address homelessness, and particularly temporary accommodation, because of these declarations. But whether the term housing emergency has been beneficial or not is questionable, because an emergency implies a quick response to get you out of it, in the same way we saw. I think there's real comparisons to how we handled the pandemic when we were in emergency. You know, we put in place measures to help protect people as much as possible, in the same way we do around temporary accommodation, whilst we also threw a lot of money at a solution to try and get people out through vaccination, and in the same way we put money back into the housing budget. So I think that the response has been good, but the point is that this isn't a quick fix that to get ourselves out of a housing emergency, which is a large degree about a market failure, is much more complex, and it's not necessarily going to be resolved in 6 months to a year time, like you had the mentality in the pandemic of we need to move out of this quickly. So maybe I would have rephrased it as something different, but the point being it's created attention and brought positive responses, but the exit plan is very confusing.
Thank you.
I think Susie Fitton would like to come in, but who's online.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so essentially the emergency is what we're calling it at the moment, and for many years we've called it a crisis. We've just finished having a two-day conference, and the First Minister came and spoke about the activist approach that the Scottish Government is taking to the housing emergency. But essentially it won't be over until the number of people becoming homeless is falling year on year, and no local authority is in systemic failure, and we're building enough homes with the right level of public subsidy in the right places to meet the needs of all those who need a social home. So as we will all agree, I think we urgently need to increase the supply of new social homes, particularly social homes. We need to make maximal use of existing homes for people in need. We need to fully fund homeless services, and we need to maximise affordability across all tenures. The scale of the challenge and the depth of the emergency has prompted a substantial response from our members. So work in partnership with councils. I think partnership working has been a real feature of the response in terms of increasing the development of new affordable homes through the Affordable Housing Supply Programme. Obviously, the comprehensive spending review and the investment in a 10-year programme south of the border and the opportunities for Scotland in that are really significant. But I think the overarching message from our members in terms of responding to the emergency is the need for certainty and the need for stability. We know that our members their core purpose is to address homelessness, and upping the number of lets to homeless households has been a feature of the response. A survey of our members in 2023 found a quarter of our members let between 50 to 77% of their stock to homeless households, with some providing 100% nomination rights to local authorities for new builds in terms of homelessness. There's been a wide range of prevention activity, not least in the 1 million tenancy sustainment fund that we're currently administering, and acquisitions in terms of the strategic acquisitions programme with a focus on family housing in some areas, to increase social rented housing, to alleviate homelessness, tackling voids. I would say some of the focus and the focus on, for example, voids and stalled sites feels quite marginal. we've been saying for years that timely repairs and meter issues are the key issue for voids, but that I would say that a fixation on voids is a distraction, really. There's been lots of work to bring empty homes back into use. But I think in terms of what would help, it's certainty and multi-year funding for the Affordable Housing Supply Programme. Local efforts to deliver more homes have been held back by significant periods of retrenchment in funding for the programme, the first between 2011 and 2015 and again between 2022 and 2025. And you just can't keep turning the tap on and off. In relation to development, the long-term uncertainty around funding, coupled with challenges in land supply, rising costs. We'll talk about cost inflation, I'm sure, today, construction cost inflation, specifically limited availability of land, willing developers in many rural areas. It's really difficult for many of our members to develop to the extent that they might, but there's no lack of commitment in the sector to building the social homes that we need.
Thank you, Convener.
Thanks. I believe Gordon MacDonald would like to come in. Thanks.
Yeah, it's just a quick supplementary. I'm trying to understand why there is a housing emergency. Because in the National Records of Scotland, I had a look at this morning, National Records of Scotland highlights that there's 2.7 million dwellings in Scotland and 2.5 million, just over 2.5 million households in Scotland. So that is an excess of 150,000 houses over the number of households in Scotland, according to the National Records of Scotland this morning. So why is there a housing emergency when we seem to have 150,000 more houses than we need? I'm happy to hear from anybody. Any volunteers? Okay, thanks, Tony.
I'll give that one a go because it is an interesting question, one to which I don't think we have a definitive answer. But I think the question is, how many empty homes is enough if you have 10% of households in Scotland seeking to move every year? Now, I don't know the answer to that question, and we've never actually looked at it. But we have 250,000 households seeking to move. You can't move if there isn't an empty house, so there needs to be empties available. My worry is that actually that number isn't enough. Not all those homes are capable of being occupied, and too many of the households who are looking to move can't find one that's available to them and affordable to them. It's a great question, but the idea that we should have no empty homes is simply wrong. The question is, do we have enough? And the evidence at the moment is that there aren't enough homes to meet the needs of everybody that wants to move or has to move. And that's why we have a backlog of some 30-odd thousand households sitting in temporary accommodation, and probably very many more, sitting in the homelessness system. Not all of those are in temporary accommodation, and probably very many more who would like to move, who may even have a pressing need to move, but simply can't find a way of doing that.
Just on the back of what you said, I accept there has to be a certain level of empty households, but what's driving the demand for additional social housing? Is it family breakdowns, or is it the fact that there's 62,000 households in Scotland facing repossession due to mortgage costs?
These are all complicated questions, but the truth is that the most affordable and the least expensive to heat homes in Scotland sit in the social rented sector. So for those people on modest to lower incomes, they are very often the best place to be in terms of meeting their housing need and avoiding poverty driven by housing costs. That's principally what underlies that increase in demand. There's no question. Very many people want to live in the social housing sector, and there simply aren't enough properties in that sector in the right places to meet those needs.
Okay.
Thank you. I believe Maeve would like to come in. Thanks.
That it's worth noting that not every local authority area is in a housing emergency as well. So that's looking at a national figure. And if you look at the hotspots areas, it's supply and demand problem, whilst in other locations actually there isn't a housing emergency and there may be surplus housing. So I think again this comes back to there are localised housing emergency and a complication with the declaration of a national housing emergency.
But the difficulty for me was Edinburgh declared a housing emergency when it was sitting on 1,500 empty council houses. Yeah. Now, they have in recent months managed to halve that, which is a fantastic achievement. but it still says, why did you declare a housing emergency when you were sitting on 1,500 empty council houses?
Yeah, I mean, if Edinburgh here, I think that what they would say is the response to the housing emergency and the additional funding has allowed them to be able to address a lot of the void issues and put that concerted effort in the same vein with acquisitions and other sort of targeted interventions. So it has been beneficial, sort of going back to Jeremy's first question of why they declared it, even though they had the stock in some shape or form. It's give them the financial resources to be able to bring them back into use. I guess the other point is people in temporary accommodation, the stock that is available isn't always suitable, particularly around families and large households. So it's a bit more of a complicated picture about, you know, what's available and what the demand is versus local and sort of specific requirements.
Okay. I think Fiona would like to come in on that, and then Tony.
Okay, it's not specifically answering that question, Gordon, which, as you said, is a very interesting question, but I think it's just worthwhile noting that we did research last year which identified that about 28% of Scottish households, that's just under 700,000 roughly, had some form of housing need. Now, that doesn't mean they are homeless. It doesn't mean they're in temporary accommodation. It may mean that it's adult children still living at home who haven't moved out yet. Yeah. So I think the whole issue of, you know, the number of households, the number of properties, the rate of household formation, I think all of that is very complex and moving parts at any one time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Tony, would you like to come in now?
Yeah, just 2 points. First of all, just to respond to that point from Homes for Scotland, we came to a very similar figure for the overall level of housing need in Scotland by a very different methodology. We looked at the extent to which the human right to adequate housing was being met, and we published that back in 2020, 2021. The link's in the document that I submitted. So the number of households in need, or the number of households facing problems with accommodation, is much higher than than I think for the most part our assessments of needs suggest. But just on the point about the nature of the housing emergency, it isn't universal, but it's not far off it. As you know, we carry out a Red, Amber, Green, or RAG survey every 6 months around homelessness services. I sent you the most recent complete one as part of our submission. I think there are 2 councils who are coming back and saying green across all 3 of the questions we ask about supply of temporary accommodation, meeting the unsuitable accommodation order, and the supply of permanent accommodation. All the others, the other 30 councils, all face some degree of pressure at some point across those 3 questions. And I think 14 or 15 of them are saying they're all red, and we're currently repeating that survey, and it's coming back with a very similar picture. And it doesn't matter where you are in Scotland, there is a shortage of social rented homes. It's as simple as that. There are more people looking for a social rented home than there are homes available each year to meet their needs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think Susie would like to come in now. Thanks.
So just to say, there's not just one side to this emergency in the areas that are the most pressured. So we carried out some research with staff in local authorities and housing associations who are involved in managing allocations, and staff spoke of demand for social housing obviously outstripping supply in many areas, as Tony's talked about. Increased demand in their area of operation, the mismatch between available stock and demand. But it wasn't just that the level of demand was increasing, but the severity of need was too. So obviously, you'll be aware of the statistics around rising homelessness, but increasing mental health needs in applicants, affordability issues, and domestic abuse. So we asked people at interview about whether or not their job had changed, and also whether or not the needs of tenants and applicants had changed. And staff talked about increasing needs around mental health, financial pressures, domestic abuse, family breakdown, the need for accessible and adapted housing. And I think this is a really key issue around how we respond to the emergency, because it's not just build. It's about building the right types of homes. And households with neurodivergent children was something that really came through, and that dealing with expectations was really the hardest part of the job in terms of meeting these, and that really had a very significant impact on people's experience of the work. So staff had over 1 in 10 staff on a daily or weekly basis had spoken to applicants expressing suicidal thoughts about their housing issues. And this really is the side of the housing emergency that doesn't really get talked about very often. We discussed yesterday at our annual conference why we need social landlords, and somebody basically said we need registered social landlords in Scotland to stop people from feeling like they need to kill themselves because of their housing situation. Now, I know that sounds really dramatic, but actually the evidence around that is really quite concerning. It wasn't that staff didn't speak positively about the difference made by housing associations and local authorities. They did, but they talked about the impact of the emergency on them professionally and personally. And with 68% of respondents saying they had felt burnout or close to burnout in the last 12 months. So I just wanted to make the committee aware of that evidence, and we can share it.
Okay. Thanks very much, Susie. Now going to invite Bob Doris in. Thanks.
Thanks, Commissioner. I think we slightly changed the question I was going to ask. I was initially going to ask how local authorities and their partners, how well they're using the affordable housing supply programme budget. But I think we've heard a lot from Susie in particular, but also if I go to Alacho or Cosla, you're kind of marking your own homework if I ask that question. So let me ask the question in a different way. Cosla suggested there's a need for more flexibility in the programme and with budget. So rather than asking how well the local authorities and partners are doing, how can we use the budgets better, and where might flexibility assist you in doing that? So it probably makes sense to go to Mike Callaghan at that point, because I've name-checked Cosla in their submission.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And in respect of flexibility, we certainly welcome that, and it's certainly one of the political positions that we've adopted. For the affordable housing supply programme, we've obviously got changing housing needs across the country. Housing demand can fluctuate in local authority areas due to various factors: population growth, demographic change, economic conditions. Flexibility will allow local authorities to adapt more quickly to these shifts and help prioritise specific projects that meet current needs. Obviously, local circumstances, local context variability, local areas in Scotland face unique challenges regarding housing supply, demand and affordability. A more flexible approach would enable local authorities to tailor their strategies to their specific local circumstances. And that obviously... Sorry for cutting across you, but you're making a passionate argument for more flexibility without saying what that flexibility looks like. Could you give a clear example of the flexibility? Because if you want to make a recommendation... Good point. Like, for example, like key worker housing, or for acquisitions in sport and community trusts. Those sort of examples. Or, for example, we've obviously got an issue with temporary accommodation, using affordable housing supply funding to fund that, and then after a few years, potentially that temporary accommodation, higher quality form of it could be flipped as a tenancy into permanent accommodation. It's having various different flexibilities, to be more specific, convener, to allow and enable that for the affordable housing supply. We'd obviously welcome a devolution of that and more local authorities more empowered to be involved in the decision making, rather than being, as it is now, a more centralised programme. So we can allow the affordable housing supply programme to be more dynamic, to meet local needs and local circumstances across the country, and maximise the use of the resources that are available.
Is that a little bit more like Glasgow and Edinburgh has it at the moment, where they've got much more flexibility in directing the cash from central government into working partnership with housing associations, for example? Is it more of that you want to see, Mike?
I'm not sure I can comment specifically on the ins and outs of specific examples, but broadly speaking, convener to allow it to be more dynamic and flexible to meet those local circumstances.
Are there any other witnesses who want to comment on how they think that budget could be better used? Fiona?
Yeah, I think the key thing we need to remember is that building a house doesn't start at the beginning and end of a financial year. You know, it doesn't work neatly like that. So the big ask that we've had continually is for multi-year funding. And that's genuine to allow for that certainty. So if you want to be building a home in 18 months' time, so what are we now, middle of 2025, if you want to be building a home at the end of 2026, you can't wait until April 2026 until you find out if there's budget coming to allow you to start. So we need that flexibility through a multi-year funding. We also need to be able to, in the individual local authority areas, to be able to overcommit in some years because we know that programmes slip. And again, so to have that flexibility to be able to say, OK, we're going to overcommit in theory this year, but we know that there's a risk that 20% will come back, so we can bring forward. So I think it's that kind of flexibility that we think is really important, because as I said, you know, we've seen over the last 3 years, we've seen a continual fall in the number of starts and completions across Scotland, and that's partially as a result of the cut to the affordable housing budget and then the reinstatement. But even though it's now been reinstated, it's slow to get those projects back up and running again. So for us, that's what flexibility means. It's that ability to move between years in order to allow the development cycle to work efficiently.
I think that's helpful, Fiona. I think the government has previously had multi-year budgets for affordable housing. I know in Glasgow at that point it made a big difference to the strategic planning for affordable homes. So I think your point's very well made. But can I ask about the overcommitting? I know slippage is a significant issue in construction more generally. What happens if local authorities overcommit and then land all their projects? How does that become funded?
Yeah, I think it's a risk, and when we're in a housing emergency, I think that, you know, there are potentially some risks that we have to take, as Maeve said earlier. You know, this is an emergency, it requires an emergency response, so maybe we need to think about things a little bit differently and to be able to build in some additional contingency to allow for that flexibility to happen, to make sure that we are delivering at the pace that we need. That sounds,
maybe I will bring you in, that sounds a little bit like more money. Would the quantum be the same? So if there was like a three-year budget, indicative figures for all 3 years, would that mean you could overspend in year one and there'd be clawback in year 2 or year 3, so you still land it financially, Fiona?
Potentially. I mean, I think that's the issue that we've always got. So you've got a target for the number of affordable homes that the government wants delivered. There's a set amount of budget that's there. You have additional costs coming in, and you know, already touched on inflation and construction costs and the costs of additional regulation. You can't have all of those three things at the same time. So something somewhere has to give, and I think that's what flexibility is understanding, okay, we may have to take a hit on this. Maybe there's a reduction in, I don't know, a particular standard that's there. Maybe we have to make an exemption there to allow costs to come down there, to allow us to build more there. That's what flexibility means in my mind.
Okay, and finally, Maeve McGoldrick.
Thank you. I think it's just to highlight sort of the obvious, the point that's been made of with the question on how to spend the budget. It's not a concern, but it's just something to be aware of, that it comes back to there's a housing emergency and there's a homelessness emergency. So the response from COSL is very much, you know, and the sort of examples that you gave in Glasgow and Edinburgh are very much targeted at things like using that funding for specific acquisitions, etc., to try and move people out of temporary accommodation. Was the point that Fiona you're talking about is the supply pedal. And I think that's just a slight concern, that because we've conflated these two issues, that the budget, there's only so much money in that budget, and the more you put into acquisitions, the more you take out of new builds. So it's just keeping this in mind of we really need to keep our foot in the pedal on both. We need to keep up with the supply, the long-term supply of homes, and nothing should jeopardise that if we want out of this in the long term. But equally, we need to deal with the backlog of people stuck in temporary accommodation, so we need to find properties quickly to move them into. So whether that's about use of existing budget or it's about seeing this as two slightly different problems and having a budget for both of those might be a more strategic option.
Okay, thank you. Susie Fitton also wants to come and give you that.
Yeah, thank you.
reiterate the need for multi-year funding and certainty and stability, but we know from members that competing priorities are impacting on their ability to develop new homes, and non-development costs specifically. The average cost of a new social rented home funded through the Affordable Housing Supply Programme in 2021 was around $158,000 for housing associations. But our members are reporting that due to increased cost pressures, particularly construction inflation, that development can cost them in the region of £190,000 to £300,000 per home, with higher costs for smaller projects or those with higher space standards or specialist provision and projects in remote and rural areas. And essentially, these costs mean that members are reporting challenges for proposed development. There's no lack of desire in the sector to be a delivery partner and to tackle the housing crisis and the housing emergency, whatever we choose to call it. But members are reporting shortfalls on the cost of development, and that these shortfalls are increasing. So cost inflation, obviously, but material supply issues, challenges with procurement, land and remediation costs, and obviously, ever increasing regulation and uncertainty about costs incurred through compliance. So in terms of, we obviously, there's obviously discussions to be had about benchmarks and flexibility around that. Obviously, they've never been a ceiling. We know that. But if we are committed to delivering more social homes, what do we need in terms of grants? We know that there can be peaks and troughs in the funding and delivery of new homes over a long-term programme. But basically, our current trajectory of approvals and starts means that it's highly unlikely that the affordable housing target will be met. And we know that one of the biggest costs for housing associations and cooperatives, and a key challenge in terms of balancing the delivery of new homes, will be transition to net zero, decarbonisation, and funding that transition will have a direct impact on the deliverability of new affordable housing. And we need a sustainable financial settlement for the sector in this regard. We know, obviously, Tony's already mentioned, actually, social homes are already the most energy efficient in Scotland. But we're approaching a new challenge with clean heating requirements and higher energy efficiency measures. So we've done lots of research in this area. We've done some research with the IPPR and Oxfam, No Home Left Behind, which talked about the current funding for social housing providers via the Social Housing Net Zero Heat Fund. Talked about it being inadequate in both the funding and operational sense to meet the current and projected costs. And so flexibility for me means looking at all of the barriers to development and having some policy alignment. I mean, really thinking about all of the ways that the Scottish Government in its wider functions and its wider policy development can actually support development. And I would say that an approach that allows the sector to balance the demands of providing homes for existing tenants and providing energy efficient homes to people who are disproportionately likely to be in fuel poverty is absolutely key to that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Liz, did you want to come in with a supplementary? Oh no, okay, sorry. I think Tony then quickly wanted to add to that. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll be as quick as I can. I'm going to revert to first principles. The Affordable Housing Supply Programme and understanding and meeting local housing needs is a local authority competence. And if we're working through principles around subsidiarity, for example, or even the Verity House Agreement, then pushing decision-making around that programme down to the lowest level makes complete sense. And I would suggest that it would be worth looking at the Edinburgh and Glasgow model to think through how that could change some of the delays that arise from and uncertainty that arises from the current consenting regime. If you want to change the programme, if a council wants to change its own programme in terms of delivery, it has to go and ask Scottish Government officials, and that creates delays in the programme. And it is a complicated programme. To deliver 5,000 social rented homes in a year, you're probably talking about 200 individual projects which have to go all the way through that process. And to get 200 projects to land, you probably have to have 400 at least within the scope of the programme that you're actively managing towards a start and a completion. It is particularly for smaller authorities managing smaller programmes. If you've got one or two more significant projects and they are delayed or they fall off the programme, that's where you end up with shortfalls and underspends. Over the piece, the programme, well, the underspends on the programme for the 3 years up to 2023 were almost entirely within the centrally managed programme, 300 million or thereby not spent, most of which was in centrally managed programmes. The local programmes do spend. But there is bound to be scope for improvement. The Scottish Government is making judgments about value for money, which are different, using exactly the same rules from the judgments that local authorities will make. And the other point, if you'll forgive me, is that the Scottish Government puts a great deal of money into this programme, but more than half the cost of a council house is being paid for by tenants, council tenants, and pretty much half the cost of the whole of the programme is coming from elsewhere. So there isn't a natural right for the Scottish Government to control everything here. We need a better balance in the way in which decisions are being made and a fleetness of foot, if you like, at local level so that councils can respond to changes within their programme. And finally, we have no year-end flexibility. If the money isn't spent, it disappears. And if money was allocated because there was a need, we shouldn't be disappearing it at the end of the year if that need hasn't been met. So there's a whole range of things that we could unpick. Unfortunately, the Scottish Government's recent review of the Affordable Housing Supply Programme, published a couple of weeks ago, addressed none of those questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Tony. I am now going to invite Liz Smith in. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr Blackwood. I wonder if I can turn attention to the private rented sector and when it comes to affordable homes. And you've mentioned quite a lot of list of challenges. You've mentioned the problem with the additional dwelling supplement. You've mentioned the demographics of private landlords getting a wee bit older. You've mentioned some negative attitudes towards some of your landlords. And you've obviously mentioned regulatory challenges. Can I just ask you, in that list of very considerable challenges, what would you cite as the most pressing difficulty that you face?
I think the most pressing is the fact that landlords, investors are leaving the sector and we're not encouraging new investment in the sector in Scotland. That's our biggest challenge at the moment. And of course we've detailed in a submission as to reasons why that might well be happening here in Scotland. But regardless, it's happening. And we need to stem the exodus of those landlords leaving the sector. And of course, you know, the issue always arises with regards to housing supply that, OK, the landlords might sell up and leave, but the properties remain. So, of course, it's still a home for someone. The issue for us in the rented sector is, of course, it's one less home to be rented out, and that's a concern for us. So I think that's our #1 challenge and priority that we're trying to deal with here.
When it comes to the question about the additional dwelling supplement, there was lots of discussion about this at the Finance Committee not that long ago. Do you feel that that actual regulation is not particularly helpful, or is it a rate change that you would like to see?
I think it's not helpful. Obviously, my wish would be that it didn't exist at all. So I do understand that governments have challenges themselves, and ADS obviously has a role to play. My understanding of ADS was always that it was there with regards to second home purchases and how that could be curbed. Of course, landlords, yes, they're buying properties, but it's not their homes. It isn't a second home for a landlord. And actually, they're purchasing it in order for it to become a home for someone else. So we always felt there should be an exemption for landlords with regards to eligibility of EDS. Going forward, and of course as part of Housing 2040, we're looking at outcomes. Scottish ministers are saying we need to see outcomes and quick fixes essentially to address the housing emergency that we've been talking about already today. We know that to build more homes, we've had obviously a lot of evidence provided about that today and the challenges around that. It takes time and it's costly. And although we've evidenced that lots of members are saying to us we're leaving the sector, we're not happy because of various reasons, But actually, we also have evidence that about 10% of people are still interested in investing. I think that's small, but it's not insignificant, and it's a positive sign. And I think we need to look at that and say, well, OK, what would encourage you to continue to invest? And in delving into that with our members, many are saying that actually we would still be interested in investing in some parts of Scotland, but the killer for us is the EDS.
Yeah, I mean, at the Finance Committee, a lot of discussion was around behavioural change, which we questioned the Scottish Government ministers on, but also the Scottish Fiscal Commission. And in the Scottish Fiscal Commission's trajectory of time, it's difficult to measure this just yet about what the behavioural change is, because it's obviously relatively new. But I think the problem is that and you're identifying this, there is a behavioural change, and that's having a negative effect on the supply of private rented accommodation. I think that's the big issue. If there wasn't the additional dwelling supplement, the Scottish Government's going to come back and say, well, we need this money because of the fiscal circumstances in which we find ourselves. What would you like to see instead?
I think, obviously, I do believe that ADS shouldn't exist for landlords. I think we need to look at the bigger picture and what we're trying to achieve here. I'm looking at it in the context of a housing emergency. How can we tackle an emergency and provide more rented homes? That's ultimately, I think, the goal we're looking at here. What we're suggesting is a moratorium, so it's not a complete end to ADS. It's about a way of the government saying we need to tackle this emergency, and for a period of 2 years or whatever the case might well be, we're going to lift that requirement of the ADS on landlords in return for rented accommodation to be provided for people here in Scotland. So that could be conditional of that a property is let for a certain time. It could also be targeted to the empty homes that we were talking about earlier. So landlords are interested in investing in empty homes. How can we incentivise them to do so?
And at what stage are your discussions with Scottish Government ministers on a possibility of a moratorium, or at least lifting some?
We're at very early stages. So we're looking at this as a potential solution to the current emergency. So we posed it, and that's why I felt it was appropriate to bring it to the
So there are meetings planned?
Yes, it's under discussion.
Okay,
so
that's helpful to know. Can I also ask about planning? Because there are obviously significant issues about planning, not just when it comes to building more homes, but Parliament is always discussing planning legislation, and there are lots of issues surrounding that just now. In terms of the private rented accommodation, given that you're saying that there are difficulties for new investment in that area, is planning having an effect on that, the length of time?
It certainly is. Obviously, the majority of our members will be those who are purchasing properties on the second-hand market, shall we say, so not necessarily investing in building new properties. But, of course, many private landlords are doing that, and institutional investors are looking to do that too. And that's the first thing they will say to you. Yes, there's planning restrictions, there are problems there, and it takes time. The issue with everything, I think, that we're discussing is just the length of time it takes to be able to build the homes and provide the accommodation that we need.
Okay. And my last question, if that's all right, Convener. Just when it comes to regional variations, there is some, I think, anecdotal evidence that in some of our more rural areas, this is a particular problem. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. And that's certainly what we're finding, that there is very much an urban and rural divide in Scotland with regards to housing supply and demand. And we want to encourage businesses to invest in rural Scotland. But of course they are saying, yes, we're willing to do that, but we need the homes for our workers to be able to live in. And that's the challenge. And often in rural Scotland, the only landlord that's available is a private landlord. And we need to make sure that they are not exiting. We're hearing that with many rural landlords just saying it's no longer a viable business proposition for us to continue to operate. So we'll go to holiday lets or actually in some extreme cases just leave the properties empty.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's certainly an impression I'm getting in my region of Perthshire and Scotland and Fife. Thank you.
I think Tony wanted to come in. Do you still want to come in, Tony?
Yes, thank you. I mean, a couple of observations. I think the private rented sector is the place where our lack of good quality data shows itself most acutely and creates most difficulties. It is not clear if the private rented sector is growing or shrinking, and the data we have, even over the last 3 or 4 years, hasn't answered that question. It is almost certainly growing in some of the busy areas, Edinburgh in particular, but some of the higher value areas. It is almost certainly shrinking in some of the rural areas. And our Garden Butte, I know, it was one of the factors that underpinned their declaration of a housing emergency. But the evidence also shows landlords are still buying houses, and that the average size of a landlord portfolio is growing. So we see evidence that some landlords are leaving the sector and other landlords are increasing the size of their portfolios. The spread of that is difficult to understand. On the ADS, I think this is be careful what you wish for. The Scottish Government published figures a month or so ago which showed that something in the order of 23% of all the homes being sold on the private market are being bought by people or organisations that already own a home. And that's even with ADS at 6%. We haven't seen the impact of the recent increase. That's people who already own a home buying a house which might otherwise be acquired by somebody who didn't own a home and needed a home. So changing the rules around ADS could make a dramatic difference to the capacity of first-time buyers and others to purchase a property on the open market. 23% of homes appear to be being acquired by people who already own them, and we have an increasing concentration of property ownership in a smaller and smaller number of people. This was, I think, more or less confirmed by John Boyle from RETI, who spoke recently at a special interest group meeting at COSLA. That's problematic. It means that people most able to buy homes in the market are people who already own homes, and I'm not convinced that's a policy outcome that we would want to accentuate. So we need to think carefully about ADS.
Okay, thanks very much. I think, Gordon, did you want to come in?
Yeah, sure, thanks. I want to return to my favourite subject about empty homes. So what I want to know is what's working well and what isn't working well. So I've already highlighted there's over 150,000 empty homes, and while I accept there is a need for some empty homes, we've got over 90,000 in the private sector, about half of which have been empty for over a year. We've got over 24,000 second homes, we've got over 20,000 short-term lets. We've talked about the council voids, which at one point were at 12,000, and we've got roughly 1,000 empty MOD properties lying across Scotland, of which we've had some recent wins in Edinburgh. But I'm keen to understand, between the doubling of the council tax, the additional dwelling supplement, the funds to purchase empty homes for the private sector, what's working well and what isn't working well in order to get empty homes back into use. Yeah.
Start off with that. Bringing empty homes back into use is very much on our agenda as the Scottish Association of Landlords, and we're working with our members to really gather a degree of intelligence from them as to why would they be interested in investing in empty homes? Are they interested, and what are the barriers to investing if that's the case? And we work closely with Empty Homes Partnership in establishing that. I think some of the evidence that's come back so far is that landlords are saying, yes, we are keen to do it, but there are a number of barriers, EDS being one. And to pick up on Tony's point, I would think that EDS, if there is a moratorium, it should be targeted, and I think it would be good to target that for empty homes, for instance. So they are the homes we want to bring back into use. How can we incentivise investors to purchase those homes? So those landlords who are actively doing that with a degree of success are saying there's issues in local areas with ownership of the existing homes. That's the #1 priority. Who owns these homes at the moment that are lying empty? So, and there's barriers there to, you can't force somebody to sell, for instance, but local authorities perhaps have those powers to be able to take over the management control of those properties. So could there be something done there? There's huge issues with that as well too, but there's a number of barriers. Planning even being one, because there could be some properties which are not designated as residential at the moment, but they could very easily be residential accommodation. So, of course, they have to go through planning to be able to have change of use. So there's a number of barriers there, which ultimately puts off investors too. and of course means that these properties continue to lie empty.
Okay. Anybody else want to come in on that? Yeah. Tony?
Yeah, I think I would lead with a very simple statement. Empty homes are a problem to solve. They are not the solution to our problem. There are lots and lots of reasons why they lie empty, and a proportionate effort needs to go into supporting owners of empty homes and bringing them back into use. But we need to not get overly obsessed about the extent to which bringing empty homes back into use can resolve the long-term problems that we have. Even if you bought all 40,000 of the long-term empty homes into use, it would give us enough for 1 year worth of homeless presentations. It wouldn't do anything for us the following year when there would be no empty homes. So getting this in balance and in proportion, I think, is important. Local authorities and housing associations have been working tremendously hard to reduce the number of voids, and we had a problem coming out of COVID, and it's taken too long to resolve that issue. We collect monthly data on voids from councils, and we can see the effort that goes in to bring those down. But the other thing we need to be aware of is that some of those empty homes are driven by low demand. There are areas where nobody wants them. The homes are no longer effective as functional homes, and we need to have a proper process for understanding obsolescence in the housing stock and removing them. We demolish about 1,000 homes a year at the moment. That's historically very low. And if you were to run that forward, it suggests that any new house you build today is going to have to last 2,500 years, which is probably not going to happen. So we need to think about obsolescence and replacement. Otherwise, we end up attempting to manage homes which absolutely nobody wants because they're in the wrong place, or they're the wrong size, or they're just not energy efficient enough. So we need to have a proper approach to understanding those things. But go back to my original point. Empty homes are a problem to solve. Even getting them all back into use will not resolve our long-term supply problems. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in. Okay, thanks. You have touched upon it already, but what impact are the responses to the housing emergency having? And I want to focus particularly on homelessness and those actually living in poverty. And I think I'm going to pose that question to Maeve. Thank you.
I mean, obviously, with the statistics have been quite clear that homelessness has been rising, levels in temporary accommodation have been rising, even though the statistics also show that homelessness has been ended. So I guess sort of the key narrative in that we are seeing people come into the system, they are being rehoused, so we are having definite local authorities are making progress, but the inflow into the system is more significant than the outflow. I think that's sort of the sort of top level greatest challenge. In terms of sort of individual impact, you know, from our own services, for example, we are seeing a broad range of need in terms of sort of right through from a significant increase over the past year in people sleeping rough presenting to us, not having any form of temporary accommodation, to be able to go through to people coming from the private rented sector who actually have very little to no support needs but are struggling financially because of the cost of living, etc. So it's just a really broad range of support needs that are being answered, personal circumstances that are being affected by the housing emergency. And I think the sort of takeaway from that is we need a range of different housing products to help them move out of accommodation. So for example, and I've said already, but there is a very big focus on families of children in temporary accommodation, and we have seen improvements and a targeted response to that. But there are other support needs that are in the system, and it's sometimes what we're seeing is people potentially sort of being left in the system for a very long period of time. So quite often it's people, sort of single men with very complex needs, or actually not complex needs, but are stuck in temporary accommodation for a long period and end up formulating sort of support needs because of their situations. So I think what we would like to see in response to sort of the rising homelessness problem is a range of targeted interventions to design different housing products. So one, for example, when we talked about sort of flexibility of how to spend the housing budget earlier, if we are to think about who in the immediate needs housing, as in who's currently homeless, as opposed to sort of future flow, thinking about, for example, really scaling up Housing First, which hasn't really been on the radar in the way that we'd like to see. So we've been very focused on families, but we think if we looked at the complex needs cohort, what we could do is make a concerted effort in targeted areas to significantly increase the availability of housing first. And also, I guess, the agenda around rapid rehousing that was very prominent a couple of years ago, and to a degree maybe hasn't been mentioned or recognised enough in governments or local authorities, not so much local authorities, more governments' response to housing emergency. So thinking, how do we get people through the system quickly? Feels like at the moment what we're trying to do is make sure we avoid rough sleeping credibly, absolutely, making sure that we don't breach duties around unsuitable temporary accommodation. But it's the point of we need to make sure we move people actually into permanent homes, doesn't get lost, and that was sort of the basis behind rapid rehousing. So yes, we're seeing a range of different support needs, a range of different tenures of housing that people are coming into the homelessness system, but we're not seeing the equivalent range of housing products for people to be able to exit the system and make sure that we manage that inflow and outflow.
Okay, that's really helpful, thank you. I believe Tony wants to come in. Thanks.
Yeah, my apologies. I mean, and the point there is well made that in order to move folk quickly through the system, we need more homes. And our problem is not that we don't want to move folk more quickly, or we're trying not to, or we're parking them somewhere. It's that we simply don't have the homes available to meet their needs. Some 70% of everybody coming through the door in homelessness services is single, and it's that particular cohort who face the most challenges in finding. Our stock isn't designed for single people, and our allocations processes aren't designed, particularly for younger single people who are more likely to move fairly regularly between the ages of 20 and 30, 35. So being able to manage those types of housing journeys, I think, is important, but having the supply that meets their needs. We have two tasks at the moment. One is plotting a way out of the housing emergency, but the other one is making sure that those people who are caught up in it are safe. And I'm not so certain that we're doing enough on that basis. In my submission, I pointed out that the estimate of deaths in the homelessness system was 242 in 22-23, 242 deaths in the homelessness system or in contact with the homelessness system. There are risks for those in temporary accommodation and for those who are not in temporary accommodation, about whom we know very little. And as I said in my submission, there's 7,000 children at least in that cohort who've been accepted as homeless, but are sitting in accommodation which is not being provided by the council. We still have a duty of care. And rolling back to the Housing First question, we have to have the housing first. But what we learn from Housing First and what we've always known is that the right support at the right moment makes a big difference. And we're simply not putting enough resources into support services to understand people's needs and the risks that they face and keep them safe. So there is, as well as finding a way out, safely managing services to people that are caught in it is critical. And a lot of that is about, one, the right home. Councils are working very hard to get back to statutory compliance and get out of the use of unsuitable accommodation. But the other one is the right support. We need to be offering more support to vulnerable households, and we aren't resourced to do that at the moment.
Okay,
thank you.
Thanks, Tony. And just on that, and you touched upon temporary accommodation. Again, the use is still high in certain areas anyway, which has been pointed out. And again, how can we work with like RSLs and like local authorities in order to try and improve that situation in terms of temporary accommodation?
It's a good question, and some of it might be being a little bit less precious about what we do with the Affordable Housing Supply Programme. We need more homes that we can, good quality homes for folk who are temporarily in the system, but they will eventually end up as permanent lets as we manage our way through the backlog. So, yes, we need to focus on increasing the supply of temporary accommodation, amongst other things. But I still think it's the issues around support and understanding risks and needs within the system is absolutely critical. I mean, there is an enormous amount of work going on around this stuff. It's not a matter of declare an emergency and then sit back. You saw the list of things from one authority in my submission. It's long. It's typical of what's going on across the piece. People are working really, really hard. But we are not currently resourced for managing 32,000 open cases within the system, 16,000 of which are in temporary accommodation. Most of those are actually in directly provided ordinary housing association and council properties. It's the group that are in the B&Bs and the hotels and the hostels that are facing the most disadvantage. And we need to focus on meeting that need, and that means more temporary accommodation.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks, Tony. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in. No. Okay. Jeremy, sorry, do you want to come in?
Thank you. I mean, I just wonder, I'd be interested to know what the panel think of Edinburgh City Council's policy, which is now to suspend its council letting policy to reserve almost all its properties for people experiencing homelessness. And I suppose what I'm particularly looking for is, are there any unforeseen consequences for this? Because my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is not a short-term decision, it's a medium to long-term decision. I'm just wondering, is this, I can understand why they're doing it, but what are the unforeseen circumstances? Maybe start with Maeve, if that's all right, since you were in order.
Yeah, it's quite obviously a live issue for us from experiencing it from the front line. And we, you know, in terms of that policy itself, so we have seen some benefits from the members that come through the door who have been able to find more suitable accommodation or permanent accommodation as a result. But other members have been negatively affected by it, you know, those that are waiting now for a particularly long period of time. So I think our sort of analysis is to try and be pragmatic and recognise that it is better that people have forms of temporary accommodation than sleeping rough, without question. So to get people off the streets and into ideally suitable accommodation through this policy will be beneficial. But the long-term implications are potentially that we see a significant increase in temporary accommodation, which, to the point earlier, is not something we'd be advocating for. And one of the principles of rapid rehousing is to try and reduce the amount of temporary accommodation available. So having that as a temporary measure is sort of the key word of if we have stock, it's about how we move people from temporary accommodation quickly into permanent accommodation. So I think it's the pragmatic approach is it's helping sort of both, most importantly, the individual not experience the trauma of rough sleeping or unsuitable temporary accommodation. It's helping local authority not breach its legal duties. But the long-term consequences are that you inflate the temporary accommodation stock and you potentially aren't increasing, therefore, the permanent stock. Looking at what Fife Council did, for example, when they did a mass flipping programme a couple of years ago, which was extremely expensive but effective in quite quickly creating a number of permanent properties. That's an interesting approach. The challenge being that we would need to bring back the stock, replenish any of the stock that got lost through flipping those temporary accommodation tenancies into permanent. You still need a volume of temporary accommodation. So I think the response is a sort of emergency response to a very significant problem, but it's not a long-term solution.
I suppose my slight concern as well is that, as you say, we end up with people being put in a property and then never been able to move out of that property, so you end up with maybe a family in a inappropriate housing, and rather than the hope that they can move to a 2 or 3 bedroom flat 6 months in a year's time, they're simply going to end up there. And how are we going to? Is there any way of monitoring that?
In terms of the time period?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if Mike might know that more than me.
Mike, would you like to come in? Thanks.
That's a good point. I think our Chief Housing Officers can advise that respect of the timescales, but I think it's a good point made in local areas where they've really been compelled in these situations to, you know, prioritise homelessness and providing with temporary accommodation, that it does constrain other factors in respect of movement for people, you know, to take different housing stock that they wish to move on to either a larger property or something that's maybe more suited to their needs or requires to be adapted. So it does come with its challenges to address those issues for temporary accommodation. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, you know, there's opportunities sometimes where local authorities have invested in higher quality temporary accommodation, where they can look at, well, for example, what Fife have done in flipped tenancies to make them permanent as part of the housing stock, which provides that opportunity. But I'll maybe defer to my colleague Tony Kane, who might provide a bit of a steer on the timescales that was mentioned there.
Thank you. 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 T
Thank you. I think Tony wants to come in. He's indicated that he wants to come in.
Only if nobody else wants to get in ahead of me. My apologies, because I missed the question about time frame. So if somebody could just a time frame for what, if you'll forgive me, I'm really sorry.
So if somebody is put into accommodation, but which may not be absolutely suitable, so maybe too small if it's 2 or 3 people in a family, because there's not going to be a movement up the list, do we know how long that person is going to be kept in that unsuitable property before we can move on to a new one?
Yeah, we don't, but we also know that councils do work hard to make sure that folk don't stay too long in unsuitable accommodation. There's always a balance, though. Is it slightly too small but in the right place? And would something slightly bigger in the wrong place be a benefit? Would the move help? Because moving folk frequently through temporary accommodation is very, very disruptive, particularly for children, and frankly, we all know is poor practice and is best avoided. So I don't think a statutory timescale would be helpful. I think people can wait relatively long periods in housing which doesn't meet their needs in every way, but there's always a bit of a compromise in the process of identifying the right house for the right household, depending on what's most important to them. Is it about size? Is it about price? Is it about location? Access to schools and jobs? So I think we can rely on local authorities to be focused on making sure that people within the system are in the best possible place, but our resources are constrained and we need more temporary accommodation at the moment. Don't forget that 40% of homeless households are not in temporary accommodation. They have refused temporary accommodation, and that may well be because they didn't fancy the quality of what was on offer. So it's much more complicated than just setting a target time for moving folk into or onto a different property. But just if I may briefly go back to Edinburgh's policy, I think it's a bold move from Edinburgh, and it's entirely down to them. I wouldn't comment on the merits of it, even if I didn't think it was a bold move. But Edinburgh were allocating 60% of their own lets to homeless people before they made that move, and it's a measure of and it's quite difficult to get to that scale of lets. It suggests that in every area, for every house type and for every house size, there is somebody on the homelessness list waiting for that home. That's not the case universally, and very often councils will find that they have a home, but there isn't anybody that it would suit within the homelessness system. That's not happening in Edinburgh, and that's a measure of the crisis they're facing. That they've done it only with their own stock, I think, is important because it leaves open opportunities elsewhere. And there are people whose housing needs are at least as pressing as those within the homelessness system. And there are people with pressing housing needs who quite consciously are not entered into the homelessness. So looked after youngsters, their housing needs are not managed through homelessness. And if we let all our homes to homeless people, looked after youngsters will either have to go through the homeless system or won't get housed. So there is a balance to be struck here. And I think Edinburgh City Council have taken a bold move, but are looking very closely at maintaining that balance. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I'm going to invite Bob Dorison. Thank you.
Just briefly, I thought Jeremy Balfour's question was very interesting. It made me think about housing allocation policies more generally. I know many families who are homeless and sofa surfing because they're in work and they want to avoid expensive temporary accommodation, including paying for it and the kind of storing of furniture and everything, all that goes with that. Also know lots of families that are fairly significant housing need, but it won't be so substantial that ever likely to get a move any time soon. And are we getting the balance right between saying we'll only allocate a property, be that to someone who's in a permanent tenancy but is in significant housing need, or in temporary accommodation seeking a permanent tenancy, they'll only house them if we wholly and completely meet their housing need, but we won't actually move them to more suitable accommodation? Because time and time again I see families in cramped accommodation who need an extra 2 bedrooms. We can find them an extra 1 bedroom, and the housing association will say doesn't meet their housing needs. But actually their housing needs will be dramatically improved if we could get a move to a more appropriate accommodation. And housing associations always fall back on allocation policies, and homeless teams also have similar allocation procedures. Do we just have to simply review that and show a bit of common sense and allocation policy to get a churn in the system? So I don't know, it's a bee's been in my bonnet that I think Mr Balfour triggered that when he asked his question. Does that hold true for any of the witnesses today? Would they like to see a review of allocation policies to get a churn in the housing system to meet some housing needs, if not all housing needs? No takers? So we'd keep a family of 5 in a small 2-bedroom property and a 3-bedroom one comes up and the Housing Association says, sorry, it won't meet your housing need, but it might be 3 years before we do meet the housing need. No one sees that as an issue?
Bob, guess what? Tony would like to come in again.
Thanks, Tony.
Because I hate the sound of dead air, not because I like the sound of my voice. What you're talking about is the habit of making the perfect the enemy of the good, or at least better. And it's in all sorts of policy areas. It's a dilemma. I think the way you would arbitrate that would be through the wishes and views of the individuals concerned. Allocations policy. This is a rationing system. How you ration houses, in the end, there are probably only 2 requirements. It has to be reasonably easily understood by everybody who's likely to look at it, and it has to seem fair. Now, and you're not going to get better than that, because you aren't going to meet every needs in a situation where we have tens of thousands more folk looking for a social rented home than we have homes available to meet their needs. So councils and housing associations need to make their own allocations policies based on their own needs that they perceive in front of them, including the needs and desires of their own tenants, whose aspirations should be part of the frame for an allocations policy. But I think in the middle of all that, where you've got doubt, then the views of the household themselves is probably the place to go to make a decision. But these are not easy. And if you're looking at somebody who needs 2 extra bedrooms and somebody who needs only 1 extra bedroom and somebody needs both extra bedrooms, which one do you choose? You have to have a system that has to seem fair. You're not going to get any better than that, because we have such a chronic shortage of the right homes in the right places.
Thanks, Tony, for talking me down off my rant. Thank you.
That was very good of you, Tony. Thank you. I don't know if anyone else would like to come in.
I agreed with Tony. I think the answer to your point about flexibility of allocations is predominantly about individual choice, and that should be put into the system. On a slightly different point about allocations policies, to a degree, going back to not necessarily saying that this is happening in Edinburgh, but just more generally, I think we do have a slight concern, and we don't have an answer to it, but it's something I think for the committee to consider is on. And Tony talked about a rationing system, and particularly in a housing emergency, we have more of a rationing system. And it's just making sure that we, I guess, don't unintentionally bring back forms of priority need into the system through the back door. And I think that should be constantly on our radar in how we tackle the homelessness system in response to the housing emergency. So, you know, the idea that everyone should be entitled to both suitable temporary accommodation and also a permanent home really needs to be a principle that both in allocations policy and other sort of practices in our response to housing emergency that we abide by.
Okay, thanks for that. I believe Susie would like to come in.
Yeah, just a quick affirmation of what Tony said, really. Listen, it's housing associations and local authorities are obviously, facing these really, really challenging decisions in relation to allocations all the time. We know that our members review their allocations policies regularly. We know that they try and communicate them effectively to tenants. That's not always easy. It can be very challenging. If you're essentially shuffling the wrong amount of cards, it's really difficult. And individual need is paramount, and the wishes and desire and housing needs of individual households is fundamental. And certainly when we speak to housing managers on a kind of weekly basis, they really are. There's no lack of desire to try and encourage movement and I think what you referred to as churn, I think, in terms of the system. I just think we need more homes.
Okay, thanks for that, Susie. I don't know if anyone else would like to come in. No. In that case, I'm going to pass over to Marie McNair. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener, and I do share the concerns expressed by my colleague Bob Doris, and I think authorities need to use their discretionary powers a bit more. So that's my bit. I won't go into a rant either, but I could go on all day about it. But I'll direct my question in the first instance to Mike, as he's kind of touched on what I'm going to ask earlier in the meeting, and then I'll go to Tony. But are you aware of any good practices happening within councils or any other areas of government that could
be shared with local authorities to assist them to deal with their housing emergencies? And to add to that, what further mitigations and learning could be put in place to stop other local authorities from declaring a housing emergency? You mentioned that earlier in terms of the good practice, but is there anything else you want to add to the first part and then maybe follow on with the second part of my question?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yes, I did mention that has been some good practice that's recognised, and particularly where we've been working with the Scottish Government, in respect that the Scottish Government have got their response, and local authorities obviously doing a lot of work, but also I would say that it's important to note that those councils that haven't declared housing emergencies are doing a lot of really good, really good hard work as well to respond to the challenges that they've got as well across the country, and they're really mobilising their efforts. It's not just the 13, it's right across the country where councils have been working really hard to respond. We know that through the practice that's been recognised, it's about what's been mentioned in the committee discussions so far about the work of the Empty Homes Partnerships, what they've been doing across the country. But as Tony said, that makes a contribution, but it's only a small part of the picture. Councils have obviously been targeting acquisitions to buy back family homes, which again adds to it. But at the same time, we know that a lot of homeless people are actually single males. So, we know further work needs to be undertaken in that, particularly in our city local authorities. Buying back family homes, though, is obviously going to be important in our local authority areas that have been most pressured to reduce the number of children in temporary accommodation, and they've also been agreeing on the percentage of lets to homeless households in Edinburgh, being, as Tony mentioned, being rather bold in their initiative across the country. So a lot of it's been brought together as good examples. We're disseminating it as part of our work through our committees and through working closely with Alacho, and we're seeking to promote this work across the country with our member councils and partners, and how we can further build upon it across the country to meet this huge challenge that we have as part of longer term solutions to address homelessness and poverty issues. But I know, obviously, working closely with our colleagues, particularly our professional chief housing officers, through like Sir Tony and Alacho, they've got a lot of really good examples of work that have been noted as good case studies that could provide the committee with.
That's helpful, Mike. And anything further you can add, even sending in with a further written submission would be helpful to the committee. Tony, do you want to come in and anything else?
Well, just to confirm that there's a great deal of effort goes on around benchmarking, and we have and good practice sharing, and there are a number of organisations that support that actively. So we spend a certain amount of our time on it. We have the Scotland's Housing Network, whose purpose is to share good practice and compare performance. We have Housemark as well, who are another large benchmarking organisation active across the sector. Susan will speak to herself, but other housing associations engage in much the same level of activity. We've produced a small number of what we would call good practice notes, not guidance notes, but good practice notes. So recently one on flipping, based largely, but not entirely, on the Fife experience, to encourage members to think about how they go about making those decisions. We've also held sessions on damp and mould, on the Internet of Things, on empty homes, as a way of sharing best practice. And we do it continually. We're currently working with Maddie Curry and MND Scotland on a practice note in relation to delivering services to households with somebody who's dealing with terminal illness. So it goes on all the time. Genuinely, it does go on all the time. And there are some areas of policy where councils just take different views. I think one example of that might be the acquisition of tenanted properties from the private rented sector. In my brief period back in Clackmannan Council a couple of years ago, we looked at I've always thought it was the right thing to do, and we acquired at least one tenanted property. I know others who have been very slow to go down that route because their view is that it's not an appropriate way to proceed. I also know others that have recently looked at that again and said, actually, it makes sense because it prevents homelessness. So the conversation is constant, and new areas and new issues are arising all the time. The conversation about internal air quality and the use of remote monitoring, for example, explored the emerging use of these technologies, I think, and what we found was there's a great deal going on, but also a lot of other councils at early stages. So the short answer is it happens all the time, and it makes a difference. But in our current context, it's just one of a number of tools and responses that you use in order to drive improvement.
No, absolutely, and I think one thing that the Housing Emergency has shown that local authorities can't work in silo anymore. They have to work with the private sector. They have to work with RSLs as well to get a resolve for the tenants. But anyone else want to add? Yep.
Susie would like to come in, Marie.
Thanks, Susie.
Yeah. Just to echo really what Tony said about good practice and the sharing of good practice. So one of our roles as a membership body really is to bring housing associations together regularly at stakeholder forums to discuss the wide range of things that members are doing across the country in, the length and breadth of Scotland, really, in terms of providing the key services that support, for example, the prevention of homelessness, so support with finding, maintaining, securing an affordable home and good practice around kind of flipping temporary accommodation to make it permanent. We've obviously just gone out to the sector with a new tenancy sustainment fund. So that in and of itself will be an opportunity to have a look at practice in that area. We obviously are constantly interested in to hear from members about their efforts to rapidly rehouse people. So Maeve talked about the need to focus and enhance the Housing First offer, and housing associations are kind of key to that, and we would like to see their role supported, so direct support to RSLs to really kind of maximise their potential to act quickly in relation to providing housing first approaches. Managing rent arrears is something that we support housing associations to share best practice on. We've recently done lots of work to provide peer support and actual kind of toolkit guidance to housing associations who want to support victim survivors of domestic abuse with a whole range of things, anything from thinking about rehousing or staying in their home, right the way through to how do we ensure that people who are trying to leave an abusive relationship are not financially penalised, anything from looking at triggers around rent arrears and how we manage that effectively. We know, obviously, that the income maximisation and support to claim social security, financial support services, money management, all of the things that that housing associations do to prevent people from not being able to maintain a tenancy. There's so much good practice around that. Provision of housing support with physical and mental health issues, support to adapt properties. There's a range of really good practice around self-assessment for adaptations, and ways of focusing the RSL adaptations programme in terms of supporting older and disabled people to live really well and literally providing adaptations that aren't stigmatising. So not the kind of white grab rail that sits on the front of a house and makes people feel institutionalised. But I was talking yesterday at our conference to Blackwood Housing Association, who've got an incredible range of ways of supporting older and disabled people to live independently. So there's just such a huge amount of good practice, anything from supporting tenants who, for example, have issues with hoarding, which is becoming a prevalent issue and one that speaks to all kinds of kind of issues around mental health a mental health crisis, really, in Scotland, and the impact of isolation and social isolation post-pandemic. But yes, I mean, I could actually talk all day about the work in the sector to share best practice, because it is an ongoing and everyday and a continuous thing.
Thanks, Susan. That was really helpful to get that on the record for the committee. Convener, I'll hand back to yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. Susie, I think you've actually beat our Deputy Convener in terms of talking, and that's Bob Doris. And
That's a challenge I'm willing to accept.
and on that note, I'm going to pass over to Bob. And that'll be our final question. Thanks.
So if you're sitting comfortably for the next 15 minutes, I'll begin. It's actually would be like a brief question, Convener, because we picked out a lateral submission for today, which said there was pressing need to ensure that those impacted by homelessness are safe and properly supported whilst they waited for settled accommodation. That seems eminently sensible, because none of us have actually want to make any of this better right away, and people are enduring whilst they're waiting for that appropriate accommodation. So I don't know if Tony would like to come in and see how he thinks that can happen, or if there's good practice in what does happen.
That's all three of us that talk too much in one go there. The answer is yes. Very happy to offer a response, since it was me that made the point. We held a session at the start of the year which was specifically focused on issues of safety for homeless households in the system, not just those in Temp, but for the whole cohort of folk who are in the system, most of whom will be in there for several months, some of whom will be in there for longer than that. We picked up the issue of homelessness deaths, and we had somebody from the Museum of Homelessness in London come up and talk to us about the lessons they are learning about supporting people, vulnerable people in temporary accommodation. The risks are not always obvious. For those that have been involved in managing temporary accommodation, you can see the violence that goes on within the accommodation, usually between residents. You can see the effect and smell very often the drugs that are being used or that these individuals use as part of their coping mechanism. What is more difficult to see is issues around bullying, financial exploitation, sexual exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation as well, within this group, and all the other risks that come with it. And there are unquestionably organised criminals targeting vulnerable homeless people, particularly in our big cities, because they can and because they know where they are. So we began that conversation. We just need a much more focused and more effective response, first of all to understanding individual risks that households face, and then structuring a response that manages those risks. And it's not all about criminality. Some of it's just about what happens to children in temporary accommodation. Shelter published a really powerful piece about the experience of children in Temp a month or so ago. It's included in the submission that I gave you. And it demonstrates that any time spent in Temp is harmful for children. But in order to manage that harm, you're going to have to talk to child protection services, talk to education, make sure that their own school knows that the risks are there and is responding and putting in the extra effort to ensure that they don't miss out on their education. So it's those types of responses. We're not currently as sophisticated as we should be. We don't have good data on the households who are in the system but not in temporary accommodation. And we can improve that because we collect it, we just don't publish it. And so we need to think about that as well. Thank you.
Maeve?
Yeah, just really quickly just to say that, I mean, our main business model in our crisis service centre is to support people who are both in temporary accommodation, particularly unsuitable temporary accommodation, and also those that are homeless but not within the temporary accommodation system. And so, I mean, the package of support is extremely broad, but I would say the main sort of benefit of providing that support is you can then carry it on when somebody does move into a permanent tenancy, and it equates to tenancy sustainment. So the sooner you engage with somebody, the better you have an understanding of their support needs. You put that package together. Once they get a tenancy, they're much more likely to not become homeless again because that package is in place. And I think sort of the second thing to say around, putting that package together is really challenging to get the support needs in place. So we do a huge amount of advocacy to try, because they're not effectively on the system in the same way. So I just wonder if there's anything, obviously with the prevention legislation, we'll have a much more sort of integrated model of support. But what was always recommended in the PRG, the original sort of recommendations, was to also look at that holistic support for when people become homeless as well as at risk of homelessness. So that's a real missing piece to both, you know, the support that people have in TA, but also when you move into accommodations. We have targeted things like Housing First for people with very complex needs, but there's a broader range of support needs that aren't being addressed around tenancy sustainment, including, you know, the work that some councils are really good at doing actually around private rented tenancy sustainment.
Okay, thank you. John, the private rented sector was referred to. You've got any reflections on how landlord and private rented sector can be supported more, because obviously sustaining good quality tenancies is an advantage of private landlords as well.
Yeah, I think obviously in addressing the housing emergency we need to look at the wider housing sector. So obviously affordable social homes is paramount, but I think we need to obviously be looking at the private rented sector too, encouraging more investment in the sector. But as I said earlier about talking about stemming that exodus of the landlords as well too. So that support I think is largely about recognition about the role that they play within the local communities, and also about providing information and guidance to landlords. That differs dramatically throughout the whole of Scotland, dependent on the relationship that local authorities have with their local private rented sector. A big part of our role is working with local authorities to ensure that they service that sector locally in the best way they possibly can. But yeah, landlords are saying, do you know what, there's nothing in this for us anymore, in the sense of we don't feel supported and they're opting to leave the sector. And for a rented sector, that's not good. We want to see more investment in the private rented sector, as well as, of course, in social housing, which needs to happen.
Thanks, John. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I believe Mike would like to come in. Thanks. I think you're on mute, Mike.
Yeah, apologies for that technical issue here. Yes, just very briefly, Convener, you know, the issues of safeguarding and relief and the risks to people that are in temporary accommodation is something that's been recognised by local government COSLA leaders as part of a range of actions to respond to Scotland's housing emergency. Something I can maybe send you committee members a copy of after the meeting, but one of which was in particular the concerns that COSLA leaders had about that matter of safeguarding temporary accommodation, in particular for women and children that are in this types of accommodation, and need for more support and protection services for them, and this be taken forward with the Scottish Government to address these sort of issues and concerns around them. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, and that information will be helpful, so thanks for offering that. I'm now going to invite Jeremy Balfour in. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, just since we've got John and Maeve here particularly, obviously we've got the Housing Bill, which is now completed stage 2, and it'd be good maybe just, maybe not for too long, but just to get on the record where you think we are with the bill, where you think there still needs to be some improvements, particularly around what we've been talking about today, both in regard to homelessness but also in regard to making sure that there are enough properties available. So I can maybe start with John and then go to Maeve, and then anyone else could jump in if that was possible.
Okay. Well, just a little question that is with regards to the housing bill and what I think about it. I think certainly where we are with stage 2, and I think there was 1 or 2 amendments proposed at stage 2, is that right? That you've been battling with. Certainly, I do hope obviously there'll be more discussion in the bill as we go into stage 3. I think it's important that the end result is that we have a bill which is pragmatic, it addresses the issues that we have across the entire housing sector in Scotland, but doesn't deter future investment. And that's really, from an investment perspective, I'm really keen to focus on that. As I've mentioned many times today, that landlords are leaving the sector. In what numbers we don't know yet. We don't have that real evidence there other than anecdotal at the moment. But we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. We don't see a shrinking rented sector. We need to give investors confidence, and private landlords are investors, as well as, of course, encourage institutional investment in the best way we possibly can too. So these are huge challenges, I think, for the bill. And when it comes to rent control, which is the big ticket item in the housing bill for us, certainly, we need to make sure there is a provision, if there are rent control areas created locally, then that rents can go up, because, of course, costs go up, and therefore that must be reflected in increased rents, albeit in a controlled manner. Our big ask going forward is looking at between tenancy increases in rents. We think that's essential. I have said before committees before that I think it's perverse that landlords are penalised in the bill, as it stands at the moment, for keeping rents low for a number of years with existing tenants. We want to incentivise landlords to do that. It's the right thing for certain situations for that to happen. And of course, if those landlords do that, don't increase rents, then the bill as it stands would penalise them as such, in the sense of when that tenant moves out, they wouldn't be able to return that property to the market rent. So we think there needs to be a mechanism of exemption there for tenancies where rents are charged below the market. So that's something, certainly it's been addressed in the consultation that's out at the moment as well too, and hopefully will be further revisited at stage 3. So I think there's huge challenges for us from an investment perspective to ensure that we have a private rented sector that works for everyone. I think it needs to work for tenants, it needs to work for landlords. A well-functioning sector needs to work for all constituent parts, and I'm very keen to ensure that that happens through the passage of the bill.
Thank you.
And on that, when you're talking about investment and private investment, there was an excellent model used several years back whereby Strathclyde Pension Fund invested into the Commonwealth Village and converted over into social housing and private housing as well. Would you like to see more of that happening?
Yes, definitely. And in fact, something that another discussion that we're having with ministers is with regards to, could we create an investment fund here in Scotland where landlords could invest in that fund? I think there's merit in that. I think there's an interest in that. We know investors, landlord investors anyway, like to invest in property. It's one of the main reasons for many of them doing it. So if they don't want to be a landlord anymore for whatever reason, can we create a facility by which they could still invest in property, but that property is utilised for the greater need of people in Scotland? And that would be to build homes or buy them in the second-hand market. Or even another big issue we put in a submission with regards to ADS is we want to see support for landlords with sitting tenants, with existing tenants, to sell their properties to other landlords. Nearly half of the eviction cases to the first-tier tribunal are a result of landlords just wanting to sell, maybe through age or whatever reason they want to exit the sector. So, and of course, the only way they can do that in many cases is by evicting the tenant. Now, if that's a good relationship between the landlord and the tenant, we should be trying to secure that home and not make them homeless, which of course puts then additional pressure on our local homelessness services. So I think we need to tie all these aspects together and say, how can we make sure we have a sustainable private rented sector for the future? How can we encourage new investment at the same time and utilise the resources that we have in Scotland? We know there's money there in private hands, so rather than endlessly asking government to put their hands in the pocket, why can't we encourage private investors to invest in homes? And I think we should be looking at a mechanism here in Scotland to do that.
Okay, thanks for that, John. I'm now going to invite Mark Griffin in. Thanks.
Thanks, Convener, and apologies for missing the earlier part of the session. A lot of the discussions focused on those facing the greatest harm as a result of the housing emergency, and that, that's absolutely right. When we've got 40,000 homeless presentations, over 10,000 kids in temporary accommodation, that's absolutely right. But beyond those at the sharpest end. We know there are 700,000 people in some form of housing need in Scotland. If we turned every single building, every single house in Scotland into a home, we still wouldn't address that housing need. The only way to address that housing need of those 700,000 people is to build more houses. My question is directed at you, Fiona, as to, since it will be your members who hopefully build those houses, what are the blockages in place just now to ramping up a level of house building activity that we've seen previously 10-15 years ago to start actually building our way out of the emergency? Because that's the only way it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Thanks for that. I think overall, one of the messages that we've been consistently trying to deliver is we think we need an all-tenure target. So we need a message from the highest level of government. It stands up and says, as a country, we need to all be working towards delivering 25,000 homes a year of all tenures. And saying that as a critical mission allows the local authorities, the planning authorities, maybe it's the utility companies, the home builders, the supply chains, everybody understanding, you know what, we have to, as a country, be building more homes. And I don't think that message is being delivered sufficiently across the entire sector. We know from our members who are building in the rest of the UK that the message that's come forward from Westminster very clearly about a mission to be building more homes, regardless of what that number is setting an overall direction for the industry that is giving more momentum south of the border than we are seeing in Scotland at the moment. So I think overall for us, I think it will be really critically standing up and saying, you know what, as a country, all of us need to be doing this for all tenures. And that would be, I think, the key to unlocking some of those other barriers that we see in the system. What I think was interesting is we went through, in preparation for this session, we went through the housing emergency action plans for all those local authorities who have declared a housing emergency, and a significant number of them don't specifically say building more homes of all tenures is part of our way out of the housing emergency. And I understand that there's a very real focus on the immediacy of dealing with the immediate homelessness problem, but I think unless we have all of those local authorities and at a national level saying actually we need to be building more at the same time, we're not going to end up fully getting ourselves out of the crisis that we're in at the moment.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I believe Tony would like to come in and give him the last word. Thanks.
Oh, I didn't realise it was going to be the last word. There is no doubt that working together with the private rented sector and the house building sector and the private sector is absolutely critical to finding a solution to our current housing needs. But the average price of a new build house in Scotland is £320,000, and we know that house builders will build at the rate that they can sell. And the rate that you can sell homes at that level is always going to be modest and has reduced in recent years because of the cost of living crisis. So it is simply not the case that our solution will be led in the private sector. It has to be led in the public sector. It has to be led through the social housing sector and the affordable housing sector. And most of these houses are being built, by the way, by private developers, so I'm not underestimating the criticality of their contribution. Most of them, I think, are coming through Section 75 agreements. And if developers can't sell their own homes, they aren't going to open up sites and build out the Section 75 agreements too. So there are stresses and tensions, but the solution to this will be a public sector solution. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And you don't have the last word, unfortunately, Tony. It's Mike that would like to come in now, so thank you.
Thanks. Very briefly, Convener, just on the back of what Tony says, we're currently working in local government to basically look at how can we avoid these situations of housing emergencies. So we're looking long term over the next 5 to 15 years. We're actually working very closely with Electro chief housing officers. We're going to be having further discussions with our heads of planning, our directors of finance and chief executives. And it'll be discussed at CAUSE the leaders how we work out basically medium to long-term actions to address and respond to Scotland's housing challenges. And it's a document we're working on. It's going to be a consultative draft produced at the end of this month. And it's something we've got over a range of areas such as funding, financial models, housing supply, strategic planning, land use market reform, stakeholder engagement. Something we'd actually like to share with the committee members to inform your thinking going forward in terms of this work that we're doing and consulting within local government, but also external partners too. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And Susie now wants to come in. Thanks.
So yes, just to say to the committee, we're about to publish research that we have previously commissioned twice before with CIH and Shelter that will identify how many affordable homes, including the social homes that are going to get us out of this situation within the next parliamentary term. And I think once we have this evidence, we want to see it influence a national ambition and the shape of the affordable housing supply programme, given the opportunity provided by the spending review. We need to support housing associations across Scotland and their work with local authorities to build the social homes that we need. We need expanded funding and flexibility, particularly for rural areas. So it isn't just about, you don't want to hit the target and miss the point, basically. You need to ensure that we're supporting communities in rural and island areas where it's not just about the numbers of homes, it's about the types of homes and where they are. We need to ensure that we're responding to an ageing population in terms of providing the types of homes, not just family homes, but also homes to accessible homes that are adaptable. And we need the workforce planning and the skills aligned to meet future housing demands. So those are the things that we're calling for.
Okay, thanks. I don't know if anyone else would like to come in. No? Well, that concludes our evidence session now. So thank you all for joining us today, and you've made some really excellent contributions. So that concludes our public business, and we will now move into private to consider the evidence we have heard today and our future work going forward.